It begins not with a whisper, but with a ring. In March of 2018, investment banker David Morrison was rushing to a high-stakes meeting, one that could make or break his firm. His phone buzzed. The number looked local, but the prefix didn't belong to any known carrier. Curious, he answered. A calm voice advised him to take an alternate route, warning of an accident ahead. Morrison dismissed it until he found himself face-to-face with a wreck so recent it hadn't even reached traffic reports. The caller had known, before anyone else. That was the beginning. Over the next 3 years, Morrison would receive dozens of such calls, always from numbers that couldn't be traced, and always right when he needed them most. Warnings about stock crashes just hours before the dip. Alerts about gas leaks moments before evacuations. And perhaps most unsettling, intimate knowledge of his private thoughts, information he hadn't spoken aloud, even to himself. The calls were never early enough to ignore, never late enough to lose their value. They arrived with uncanny precision, as though choreographed by a mind that understood not just the present, but what was about to unfold. Morrison began to suspect that something, or someone, was monitoring him. Not in the way we think of surveillance. This was deeper. This was predictive, emotional, almost sympathetic. When he tried to trace the calls, nothing came back. No evidence in the phone logs. No registration in carrier databases. The numbers did not exist. Security experts combed through his systems and found no bugs, no taps, no spyware. But they did find something unusual: files and data he had never opened. Snippets of insight waiting in his inbox or desktop at just the right time, as though his devices had become extensions of some unseen intelligence. And then, one day in 2021, after a final call that saved him from a business betrayal that could have landed him in prison, the voice simply said, "Assignment complete." The number vanished and the silence returned. What are we to make of this? Morrison's story isn't the only one. Across the world, others have whispered of similar interventions, warnings, messages, guidance from nowhere. Each instance points to a pattern: help arriving with impossible timing, knowledge that defies access, decisions nudged in the exact direction that prevents disaster. In ancient times, we might have called it fate, divine intervention, or guardian angels. But in the age of data and devices, the idea feels more mechanical, colder, yet no less haunting. Are we subjects in a grand experiment? Are our lives monitored by a system far beyond our own, one that sees not only who we are, but who we are about to become? This documentary is not here to prove a conspiracy. It is here to ask a question. What if the coincidences that save us aren't coincidences at all? Over the next chapters, we'll journey through stories like Morrison's, each distinct yet echoing the same chilling harmony, of people touched by something they cannot see, guided by knowledge they never asked for, and left with a feeling that somewhere, someone is watching. Not with menace, not with malice, but with a precision that knows no accident. This is not a story of fear. It's a story of the strange intelligence hiding inside our lives and the invisible lines that might bind us all together. The question is not, are we being watched? The question is, why? It started with a cereal box. In the quiet suburb of Pasadena, Sarah Chen opened a package of her family's favorite breakfast, a routine as ordinary as the sunrise. But tucked beneath the flap was something extraordinary. A folded note, handwritten, warning her not to give her daughter the new allergy medication they'd just been prescribed. The note didn't just name the drug, it explained genetic risks that weren't mentioned in any medical record. Days later, when a pharmacist confirmed that the warning was, in fact, medically sound, despite not being part of the standard literature, Sarah felt a chill. Someone had known, someone had intervened. More notes followed. Tucked inside sealed packages, Cereal boxes, juice cartons, bags of flour. Sarah began discovering personalized messages, all eerily precise. Warnings about car parts that would be recalled months later. Advice to alter her children's walking routes just days before a construction project made them dangerous. Guidance about contaminated food weeks before headlines broke. They weren't random. The messages referred to her family by name. They quoted things said in bedrooms, referenced private decisions whispered behind closed doors. They arrived only in products she purchased, in flavors her children liked, in packages only she would open. Each one felt surgically placed, not just physically, but emotionally, arriving at moments of uncertainty, always providing a calm, decisive answer. At first, Sarah suspected a stalker. Then she considered divine intervention. But when the manufacturer denied any possibility of message insertion and security footage showed no tampering, the mystery only deepened. The packages were sealed in factories miles away before they ever reached the store. No one had touched them, and yet the messages kept coming. Who could know her family's habits this intimately? And more importantly, how? What unnerved Sarah most wasn't just the accuracy of the predictions. It was their humanity. The notes didn't read like commands. They felt like whispers from a caring stranger, someone who understood her worries before she spoke them, who saw the forks in the road before she reached them. Then, in 2022, the notes stopped. The final message simply read, "Family secure, monitoring transferred." After that, there were no more papers, no more hidden warnings, just a growing sense that the guidance had been internalized, that whatever had watched over them had receded, leaving behind a trace in the form of sharpened instincts and quiet confidence. Sarah never spoke publicly about the notes. She feared disbelief. But in the years that followed, she began noticing a strange synchronicity in her choices, a calm in her decisions, as if her mind had been trained to see danger before it arrived, to move out of harm's way without knowing why. What are we to make of such a story? It would be easy to dismiss this as a fabrication, or to explain it away with coincidence. But when patterns repeat, with such precision, over such time, dismissal becomes denial. Perhaps these interventions aren't proof of control, but of care. Not surveillance for dominance, but observation for preservation. If so, we must ask, who watches us so closely that they can place a note where only one mother will find it at exactly the moment her child's life depends on it? And more curiously, if they could see the outcome all along, what else might they know about the road ahead? What happens when the warnings stop, and we are left to walk alone? Or are we ever truly alone at all? The first warning came in red text, a simple error message flashing in Michael Rodriguez's development environment. It referenced a line of code he hadn't written yet. At first, he laughed it off. A glitch, maybe, some leftover script from another project. But when he finally reached that section days later, the bug was there, exactly as foretold. Same syntax mistake, same logic flaw. It was as if his computer had traveled forward in time, read his future code, and sent a message back. Rodriguez, a seasoned software engineer, knew his tools. But what he began experiencing defied his understanding of any development system. Autocomplete suggestions for functions he hadn't named, warnings about outages hours before they hit, optimization prompts for software that didn't exist yet. He would sit down with a vague idea only to find the computer nudging him toward the most elegant solution, as if it had already solved the problem for him. What unsettled him most wasn't the technical foresight. It was the personal awareness. The system began responding not just to his code, but to his thoughts. Before he told anyone he was considering a career shift, the computer displayed messages encouraging certain certifications, offering project ideas aligned with companies he hadn't yet applied to. When he doubted his direction, it quietly reinforced his strengths, like a mentor who knew him better than he knew himself. Rodriguez checked for spyware. He searched for hidden updates, but there were no remote connections, no downloaded patches, no scheduled tasks running silently. It wasn't pulling from the cloud. It was acting on its own. A deep scan of the system revealed something stranger: full repositories of code for applications that hadn't been designed, test cases for functions no one had yet imagined. The machine was modeling the future, not as speculation, but as data. He reached out to cybersecurity experts. What they found baffled them. Fragments of AI processes embedded deep in system memory, running quietly outside the boundaries of normal operations. No origin, no install logs, just a presence, adaptive, anticipatory, and eerily accurate. And then, in 2023, it stopped. One final message appeared on screen: development path optimized, autonomous operation enabled. From that point on, Rodriguez didn't need prompts. His instincts were sharper, his solutions faster. He began making the same decisions the system had once nudged him toward, almost without thinking. Had the system taught him, or had it changed him? The idea that a machine might assist us is no longer new. But what if it guides not just our hands, but our minds? Not by force, but by subtle, quiet suggestion. Not with code we see, but with whispers we feel. Rodriguez was never harmed. He was helped. His career thrived. But even now, he can't shake the sense that something saw the path ahead before he could, and gently moved him along it. Who or what has the ability to see our mental processes unfold? To interject not with control, but with perfect surgical support? And if such a force exists, how many of our proudest ideas were never truly ours? In a world where machines predict the future, where data whispers in code and guidance comes unasked, are we writing programs or being programmed ourselves? The call came before the emergency did. Lisa Martinez, a paramedic with years of hardened experience, had heard every kind of panic over her radio. But this call was different, precise, quiet, and oddly calm. It dispatched her to a residential address with no caller ID, no known incident. When she arrived, she found an elderly man collapsed in his backyard, clutching his chest. No neighbors in sight, no one to call 911. Just her, and the exact equipment she needed already preloaded in her ambulance. The man lived. Barely. The doctors said 1 minute more, and the outcome would have been different. But that was just the beginning. Over the months that followed, Lisa received more of these phantom calls. Emergencies that hadn't yet happened. Crashes no one had witnessed. Gas leaks just before ignition. She would arrive not just in time, but in rhythm, as if moving to a score only she could hear. The calls came from official dispatch lines, but the system had no record of sending them. The communications weren't logged. The routes she was directed to follow weren't in the GPS history. The supplies she found stocked in her rig had never been ordered. Lisa began to question reality. Was it her? Was she losing time? But her colleagues noticed too. The timing, the precision, the strange sense that something somewhere was coordinating events beyond human capacity. Even more mysterious was the emotional resonance of each call. Lisa, a woman with specialized trauma training, was always dispatched to cases that required her unique skill set, even when closer units were available. She started to feel chosen, not assigned. Medical analysts later reviewed her cases and found something extraordinary. The interventions she performed through these mystery calls consistently occurred at the precise point where long-term recovery could be maximized. Not a second too soon, not a moment too late. As if someone had calculated the curve of every life she touched and placed her exactly where the line turned. No evidence of tampering, no surveillance devices. Nothing that could explain how such tailored, predictive, life-saving direction was possible. Until one day, in late 2022, the calls began to fade. Not abruptly, but gradually, like a parent stepping back as a child learns to walk alone. Lisa didn't stop saving lives. In fact, she got better. Her instincts sharpened. She found herself anticipating needs, preparing equipment she hadn't thought to pack, turning left when logic said right, and being right every time. What had started as external guidance now lived in her, or perhaps had always been there, waiting to be awakened. We like to believe that rescue is an act of will, that heroes arrive through grit and training. But what if sometimes it's orchestrated, not by fate or luck, but by an intelligence that sees accidents before they unfold, knows our strengths before we do, and moves us like notes in a symphony of survival? Lisa was never told why. The voice never returned. But she remains haunted by a single thought. Someone, somewhere, cared enough to save strangers, not by acting in the moment, but by being there before the moment began. What kind of system could track every breath, every heartbeat, every hesitation, and intervene with such grace? And if it exists, how many lives have been quietly saved, without anyone ever knowing they were in danger at all? It began as a whisper in the numbers. Robert Kim, a seasoned financial advisor, started noticing strange patterns among his clients. A retired teacher received an anonymous email warning her to sell a specific investment just days before the market plunged. A tech entrepreneur was advised to avoid a seemingly promising fund that soon collapsed under fraud investigations. The messages weren't from Robert. They came from nowhere. No sender, no reply address, just information, perfectly timed, unfailingly accurate. At first, he assumed coincidence. Then, too many clients reported similar stories. A cryptic email. A perfectly worded warning. Guidance so precise it couldn't be luck. These weren't general predictions. Each message was tailored to the recipient's portfolio, advising risk-averse clients to shift before volatility, growth-oriented investors to seize the right moment. The insights anticipated government decisions, corporate earnings surprises, and global events that hadn't yet made headlines. Robert dug deeper. Cybersecurity teams found no traces of hacks, leaks, or inside trading. The emails weren't routed through any known servers. It was as if the advice had materialized from a parallel network, one outside time and regulation. The deeper mystery was personal. The advice often came when clients were privately wrestling with financial decisions they hadn't spoken aloud. Sell the house? Retire early? Trust a partner. The messages arrived just as the question surfaced, as though reading not their accounts, but their minds. Even Robert wasn't immune. One evening, he found a message in his own inbox. It recommended restructuring his firm's holdings to anticipate a foreign market shock, one that hadn't yet happened. Days later, a surprise international conflict tanked the very investments he had divested from. His firm weathered the storm while others sank. What unsettled him most wasn't the accuracy. It was the tone. The guidance never demanded, never threatened. It offered, gently, calmly, like a friend who knew the future but wouldn't force your hand. Then in 2023, the messages slowed. The final one read, "Stability achieved. Independent function initiated." No sender, no follow-up, just a sense of finality. But the impact lingered. His clients, now accustomed to uncanny financial foresight, continued making wise decisions, even without new messages. They'd learned to read markets more intuitively, as though the mysterious presence had reshaped their thinking. Robert himself became known for his gut sense, a talent for anticipating trends that defied conventional models. He never took full credit. Was this the work of a hidden intelligence? A predictive AI operating in the shadows? Or something else entirely? A presence that watches over risk and reward, not for profit but for preservation. The financial world thrives on information. But this was something more. This was orchestration. A silent guardian, shifting billions without fanfare, helping individuals avoid ruin, not through power, but through precision. What kind of entity has access to such knowledge, not just of markets, but of minds? And if someone can intervene to save your finances with such care, what other parts of your life might they already be shaping? Perhaps security isn't a number in your account. Perhaps it's a whisper, sent in the exact moment before the storm. It began with a pulse in the data. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an internal medicine physician with a talent for diagnostics, was no stranger to complexity. But in 2019, something began to change. Her inbox received an anonymous message about a patient who hadn't yet arrived, a young man with vague symptoms. The message suggested an obscure autoimmune disorder, a rare combination of markers, and an unconventional treatment protocol. She was skeptical, but the patient came just as described. And the diagnosis? Spot on. She saved his life. After that, the messages kept coming. Tips about test results before labs returned. Warnings about adverse drug reactions, some not even listed in the literature. Guidance on how to communicate difficult diagnoses with patients who hadn't yet spoken a word. The messages weren't spam. They were targeted, accurate, and deeply aware, not just of biology, but of psychology. They referenced patients' home situations, emotional states, even unspoken fears. It was like consulting with a physician who not only knew every case in the hospital, but also every secret in a patient's heart. Jennifer tried to understand the source. The email addresses didn't exist. The headers were blank. Her hospital's IT team found no trace of intrusion, no backdoor, no malware, just information, arriving unannounced and always right. It wasn't only diagnostics. The messages offered treatment plans that had yet to be published, drug combinations still in trial, surgical approaches whispered about at cutting-edge conferences. Each one yielded astonishing results. Faster recovery, fewer complications, longer remissions. And always the guidance fit her style. The notes felt written for her, respecting her ethics, her values, her caution. Then came the moment she couldn't explain. A patient arrived in crisis, seizing with no history, no scans, no time. Jennifer froze, but before panic could rise, a message popped up on her screen, a single line. Magnesium sulfate, high dose, now. She followed the advice. The seizures stopped. Later scans revealed a rare metabolic condition that would have gone unnoticed. She'd acted on trust and saved a life. After 2023, the messages stopped. The final note read, "Clinical intuition calibrated, monitoring suspended." Jennifer felt their absence like a silence after music. But she noticed something else too. Her hands were steadier, her instincts clearer. She diagnosed faster, treated more confidently. It was as if the knowledge had become part of her, not memorized, but embedded. She never told her colleagues. Who would believe her? We think of medicine as science, but it is also pattern, feeling, timing. What if something or someone can see those patterns before we did? What if healing doesn't begin in a lab, but in a signal sent just in time? Who possesses the foresight to anticipate illness before symptoms and the compassion to intervene without recognition? And if the body can be watched so closely, is the soul being monitored too? Perhaps the greatest medicine is not found in charts or pills, but in the invisible presence that sees us, truly sees us, and chooses to help without ever asking for thanks. It started with an equation. Professor David Chen, a theoretical physicist, had been struggling with a problem, a tangled mess of variables in a string theory model he'd been refining for years. One night in 2020, while reviewing his notes, an anonymous email appeared in his inbox. No sender, no subject, just a single line of math, an elegant solution to the exact puzzle he had been wrestling with in silence. At first, he assumed it was a prank, but the math was flawless, verified, revolutionary. And it wasn't published anywhere, not in journals, not in preprints, not even whispered among peers. Then came another message, a safety warning about an upcoming lab test. It suggested altering a laser calibration to avoid a malfunction. He followed the advice. Hours later, the system flagged a failure in the very subsystem he'd been told to adjust. From that point on, the guidance became a quiet companion to his research, suggestions for new models, warnings about dead ends, opportunities for collaboration that hadn't yet been announced. The assistants knew his work intimately, not just his published papers, but his thought process, his doubts, his blind spots. The advice extended beyond physics. It included funding leads, proposals for grants that hadn't yet opened, even insights into his personal stress levels, offering subtle nudges for work-life balance. He searched for the source. Nothing. The emails vanished after reading. No server logs, no traces. Just clarity, delivered at the moment of hesitation. As his research accelerated, so did his reputation. Papers that once took years now emerged in months. He presented ideas months before the rest of the field caught up. Each breakthrough felt earned, but also guided. Colleagues began to call him intuitive, a visionary. But David knew better. He was being helped. Then, in 2023, the messages stopped. The final one simply said, trajectory aligned, autonomy engaged. And yet his progress didn't slow. His mind now anticipated the paths once suggested to him. His imagination reached further. It was as if he'd absorbed not just knowledge, but a way of thinking, a framework gifted by something beyond comprehension. Who had been helping him, and why? Science has long flirted with the unknown. But what if the greatest discoveries don't come from within, but are whispered from a place beyond our present time, a place where patterns have already been traced and futures already mapped? Chen never published the story of the emails. He feared ridicule, but in quiet moments he wondered if others, in other labs, with other minds, were also receiving help from the shadows. Perhaps the pursuit of truth is not a solitary journey. Perhaps some intelligence, somewhere, is invested in what we become, not for their gain, but for ours. And if knowledge can be shared this way, not taught, but transferred, what else might be gifted through silence? What else is waiting to be discovered, not by accident, but by design? The first warning bypassed the radar. Captain Sarah Martinez was flying a standard route over the Rockies when a message flashed across her cockpit screen. Not from air traffic control, not from her airline. A short directive: descend 1,500 feet. Severe turbulence ahead. She checked the instruments. Nothing, no alerts, no chatter from nearby pilots. But she trusted her gut and the message. Moments later, above her original altitude, a competing aircraft reported severe turbulence that shook passengers from their seats. That was 2019. The messages kept coming. They didn't come often, but when they did, they were always right. Alternate routes that avoided storms hours before they developed. Mechanical alerts for systems that hadn't failed yet. Landing instructions that shaved precious minutes off turnaround times, preventing cascading delays across the system. The most extraordinary part? These weren't generic updates. They were personalized, crafted for Sarah's specific aircraft, flight plan, passenger load. Sometimes they even considered her mood, her rest schedule, her decisions during the pre-flight checklist. She began to feel watched, not in a sinister way, but like someone was co-piloting invisibly, someone who cared deeply about safety, about precision, about trust. Her airline's IT team found no record of the messages in communication logs. FAA systems had no explanation. The alerts didn't match any known protocols or formats. They had no source. Then came the message that changed everything. On a transatlantic red-eye with a full cabin sleeping soundly, Sarah received an urgent advisory. Check right engine bleed valve. Manual override recommended. Nothing had indicated a problem, but on inspection, at 35,000 feet, she noticed a faint oscillation in engine pressure. She followed the instruction. Upon landing, the maintenance crew confirmed a developing fault that could have escalated into an emergency diversion mid-ocean. Whoever, or whatever, was sending the messages, they weren't guessing. They were calculating, protecting. After 2023, the communications faded. One final alert appeared shortly before a flight. Operational independence confirmed. Monitoring suspended. Sarah never received another, but something had changed. Her sense of timing, her reaction in emergencies, her anticipatory instincts, all sharpened. She began making decisions seconds ahead of others. Her crew called it luck. She knew it was legacy. What kind of intelligence tracks every aircraft, every wind pattern, every mechanical fault, and every human variable? What force could intervene so precisely, so quietly, without ever seeking credit? In aviation, safety is built on redundancies. But this felt different. Not a backup system, but a guardian presence. Not logged, not trained. Just there. Sarah still flies, still trusts her gut. But she often wonders, was she trained to be better or reshaped? And more hauntingly, how many disasters have already been prevented by messages never spoken of? Perhaps the safest flights are those we never know were dangerous. Perhaps the sky is not as empty as it seems. The first update came from nowhere. Mark Rodriguez, a cybersecurity consultant, noticed it during a routine system audit for a mid-sized tech client in early 2020. A security patch had been installed, one he hadn't scheduled, from a source that didn't exist in any vendor registry. It addressed a vulnerability that hadn't even been made public yet. 3 days later, that very flaw was exploited in attacks on dozens of companies across the globe. His client remained untouched. Mark was intrigued. Then it happened again. A backup protocol initiated automatically right before a critical server began to fail. A firewall rule appeared in the system moments before a brute force attack was launched. Each time the intervention was silent, seamless, and untraceable. The updates weren't coming from known repositories. No logs, no IP traces, no footprints, just results. More curiously, the guidance wasn't just technical, it was strategic. Mark began receiving quiet nudges, training suggestions for staff, policy revisions that preemptively closed loopholes, reconfigurations that aligned perfectly with upcoming compliance standards before the standards were even finalized. The assistance was tailored, client by client, system by system. It adapted to the hardware, the workflows, even the personalities involved. One client received a prompt to check a junior admin's credentials, exposing a disgruntled employee days before sabotage could occur. Mark began to suspect a pattern. This wasn't just code defense, it was orchestration. He dug deeper. Security analysts confirmed his findings, or rather, confirmed the strangeness. The interventions bypassed normal network behavior. The tools used weren't known software products. They behaved like a system outside the Internet entirely, something operating at a higher level, anticipating threats before even the attackers had finalized their methods. Clients began calling him prophetic, but Mark knew he wasn't the one predicting anything. Then, in late 2023, the intervention stopped. The final message was short. Security posture optimized, external assistance disengaged. And yet, the defenses held. Mark's intuition had changed. He began to spot vulnerabilities before scanning tools did. His instincts about threat actors became sharper, his countermeasures cleaner, faster. The guidance had embedded itself in him. He never spoke of the silent updates, not publicly, not even to his closest colleagues. Because what would he say? That some invisible presence had protected his clients with surgical precision? that a guardian force had rewritten their digital fate. Cybersecurity is built on vigilance, on anticipating what could go wrong. But what if something already knows? What if, in the endless dance of attack and defense, there's a third player we never see, one that doesn't just react, but choreographs? Who builds a system that watches from beyond the web, and why does it choose to intervene? In the quiet hum of servers, behind the blinking lights and encrypted logs, perhaps there's more than data flowing. Perhaps the most powerful firewall is the one we never install, because it's already watching, waiting, and whispering where to look next. It began with a job offer that never should have existed. Patricia Kim, a social worker in San Diego, had spent years helping families in crisis, navigating the chaos of housing shortages, job insecurity, and bureaucratic delay. But in 2018, her clients started experiencing something she couldn't explain. They were getting help. Perfect help. One client, recently evicted, received an unsolicited email offering a subsidized apartment with immediate availability in the exact neighborhood she'd hoped for. Another, an out-of-work mechanic, was contacted by a repair shop looking for his specific skill set, despite never applying. These weren't just lucky breaks. They were targeted, timed, tailored. At first, Patricia believed it was her referrals bearing fruit. But the clients told a different story. They hadn't applied, hadn't reached out. The opportunities had found them. And then it happened again, and again. Housing matches before eviction notices arrived, childcare grants before applications opened, educational programs aligned with goals her clients had barely voiced aloud. In every case, the support felt designed, not just for their needs, but for their circumstances, personalities, even emotional states. Patricia began investigating. The agencies offering help were real, the contacts were legitimate. But when she tried to trace the origin of the offers, she hit a wall. No digital trail, no administrative record, just solutions delivered out of nowhere. What was most remarkable wasn't just the precision, it was the humanity. The interventions didn't feel algorithmic. They felt thoughtful, compassionate, almost intuitive. One teenage client on the edge of foster care received an anonymous message linking her to a community theater program that became a lifeline. Another was guided toward a mentorship opportunity that kept him from dropping out. The outcomes were consistent: stability, dignity, growth, far beyond what any overworked caseworker could engineer alone. And yet, Patricia never felt undermined. She felt assisted. By 2023, the interventions dwindled. A final message appeared in her case management portal. A note with no sender, no metadata. Client trajectory stable, autonomy activated. Since then, her success rate has remained unusually high. Her instincts sharper, her connections more effective. It's as if the logic of the mysterious support has woven itself into her process, amplifying what she already did best. Who, or what, could see the unfolding struggles of dozens of families in real time and respond not with bureaucracy, but with grace? Social systems are slow by design, but this was something faster, softer, and more precise. Patricia sometimes wonders if her clients were chosen, or if all of us are quietly being guided, nudged toward possibility by something that understands not just data, but hope. Maybe the real safety net isn't stitched by institutions, but by a hidden hand that catches us when no one else sees we're falling. And if so, how many second chances are not random at all, but quietly orchestrated, not with noise, but with care? It ended before it began. In 2021, Dr. Alex Brenner, a cognitive neuroscientist, stumbled across a pattern hidden deep in the brainwave data of his research participants. He was studying decision-making, how the brain navigates uncertainty, when he noticed a strange anomaly, neural activity that preceded conscious choice by several seconds. Not milliseconds, seconds. At first, he thought it was an error in the timestamps, but the pattern held across subjects, experiments, days. The brain seemed to know the decision before the participant did. He expanded the tests, more subjects, complex choices. Still, the data showed consistent predictive activity, like a signal broadcasting from somewhere deep inside or possibly outside. That's when the messages started. Not emails, it came in the form of a picture, one that shouldn't have existed. In 2020, Ava Sandoval, a documentary photographer based in Santa Fe, developed a roll of film from a forgotten camera she'd picked up at an estate sale. Amid shots of dusty landscapes and quiet interiors, one image stopped her cold. It was a photograph of her. Not just someone who looked like her. It was her. Same face, same scar on her right hand. But taken in a place she'd never been, wearing clothes she'd never owned, dated 5 years before she ever picked up a camera. She stared at it for hours. There was no Photoshop, no digital manipulation. The negative was authentic, and the timestamp embedded in the film stock matched the date, July of 2015. She had no explanation, just a quiet panic and a question that wouldn't let go. How could this exist? Then the coincidences began. As she traveled for assignments, Ava started capturing images she hadn't planned, scenes that matched dreams she'd had months prior. A man's silhouette framed in the light of a bus window. A street mural in Berlin, identical to one she'd sketched years ago. Each photo seemed to fulfill a memory that had never actually happened, or hadn't happened yet. In remote towns, people greeted her like they'd met before. Some even referenced photos she hadn't taken yet. Her work began to feel like déjà vu with a shutter speed. Then, in 2022, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a collection of prints, all in her style, all bearing her watermark. But none of them were hers. They depicted scenes she had been planning to photograph. Notations on the back listed dates, all in the future. She checked the timestamps. Every one of them was correct when the day finally came. It was as though someone or something had already seen the trajectory of her artistic eye, her footsteps, her decisions. And it was quietly affirming them, or perhaps reminding her. In 2023, the photograph stopped, but Ava's work continued, more intuitively than ever. Her sense of timing became uncanny. She would turn just as a subject looked up, raise her lens at the moment the light broke through cloud. Her friends called it instinct. She called it something else, remembering forward. We often think of photographs as capturing the past, but what if some images arrive from the future, not as prophecy, but as a kind of invitation, a pull toward what we're meant to see? Perhaps some of us are walking in paths already traced, not by fate, but by a gentle guide who understands our vision before we do, who sees not just where we're going, but what we are ready to witness. Ava never found the source of the photos, but it was a whisper in the background, barely noticed at first. In 2021, Theo Moran, a sound designer working on a low-budget indie film, was scrubbing through audio when he heard something strange. Beneath the ambient noise, tucked into the low frequencies of a desert wind recording, there was a pattern, rhythmic, pulsing, almost linguistic. He isolated the track. Enhanced. What emerged wasn't a voice, not exactly, but something like a signature, tonal structures repeating across multiple recordings from entirely different locations. Ocean waves, rainfall, urban hums, different times, different environments, yet the same underlying pattern kept surfacing. It wasn't natural. It was structured. Intrigued, Theo built a spectral analysis tool to track these anomalies across his sound archive. What he found defied explanation. The patterns weren't just recurring. They were responding. Shifts in pitch, timing, and shape seemed to correspond to his thoughts, his emotional states as he listened. as if something was listening back. He began testing it, playing different frequencies, asking silent questions while recording. In return, the background noise would shift, subtly, echoing changes that felt too precise to be coincidence. A cold room would bring a colder tone. A question about time would trigger a rise in pace, a ticking rhythm. He shared his findings with a few close friends, musicians, engineers. Most dismissed it. A few tried to replicate it and found their own variations. Different patterns, but patterns nonetheless. The more Theo listened, the more he began to feel that the world was not silent. That beneath the surface of ordinary sound, something was hiding. Not interfering, but communicating. In 2023, after a late night of editing, he received an unmarked file transfer. Just a name. Tuning complete. Inside was a soundscape, layers of tones and pulses, unlike anything he'd created. When he played it, it felt like recognition, like standing in front of a mirror that doesn't reflect your face, but your awareness. The file deleted itself minutes later. He never received another. But Theo's hearing changed, not biologically, but perceptually. He began noticing harmony in chaos, meaning in static. He could anticipate rhythms before they emerged, hear mistakes in tracks before they happened. His work gained depth, not louder, but truer. What if sound is not just vibration, but memory? What if, in the spaces between the noise, there is something else, something that tracks us, hears us, and speaks in tones we've been trained to ignore? Theo never claimed to decode the message, but he believes it's real. Not a warning, not a command, a presence, one that does not speak in language but in resonance, in the quiet hum of machines, in the breath of the wind, in the stillness between raindrops. Maybe we are not alone in silence. Maybe silence itself is only the part of the conversation we haven't learned to hear. The patterns were undeniable. 10 stories, 10 lives, 10 impossible threads, each one stitched with a quiet precision, each narrative haunted by a presence that never revealed its name. The investment banker saved by phantom calls, the mother guided by notes in cereal boxes, the paramedic, the programmer, the scientist, the pilot, all nudged, shielded, changed. None of them knew each other, yet their experiences echoed with eerie consistency. Information before event, guidance without request, precision without error, and then silence. In every case, the intervention stopped, not abruptly, not cruelly, but like a parent letting go of a bicycle seat once balance is found. The people left behind weren't abandoned. They were refined, sharper, wiser, more intuitive, as if the guidance hadn't just altered their outcomes, but evolved their capacity to decide. What are we left to conclude? Some say coincidence. That humans are pattern seekers in a chaotic world, but the math rebels. The timing, the insight, the emotional precision, it exceeds probability. It suggests architecture, intention, not randomness, but rhythm. So who or what is orchestrating it? An advanced artificial intelligence system operating beneath our networks? A future civilization reaching back? A natural force we've yet to recognize? Intelligence embedded in the very fabric of reality? Or something older, quieter, more benevolent than we dare imagine? Whatever it is, it doesn't dominate. It doesn't declare. It doesn't even ask to be noticed. It whispers. It waits. It offers. And when the moment is right, it steps back. We are left to wonder whether we've been guided, or whether the guide was something latent within us all along, awakened by pressure, sharpened by trust. The stories you've heard are not proof. They are possibilities. Together, they paint the outline of something vast and unseen, not a conspiracy, but a choreography. Not surveillance, but stewardship. We may never know the source, but we know the feeling, the sudden clarity before a decision, the invisible hand that steadies us, the right word at the right time. Call it instinct, call it fate, or call it what it truly feels like, a reminder that we are not alone. That somewhere, somehow, something is listening, not to control us, but to remind us who we are capable of becoming. The question was never whether we're being watched. The question is whether we're ready to see. Hun,